Assessing the many forms of inductive arguments. As you know, there are two main types of arguments, deductive and inductive. Assessing the validity of deductive arguments is fairly straightforward, but it is a little more complicated for inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are built by pulling together a range of premises, both facts and opinions, and examining them to draw some broader or larger conclusion about the issue at hand. From a set of premises judged to be true or at least acceptable, we then extend our knowledge to construct a conclusion that we believe follows from those premises. So, for inductive arguments, premises provide more or less support for the leap we take in formulating the conclusion. There are a number of ways people move from known premises to the conclusion, which can be thought of as newly created knowledge. In this episode, you will learn about a primary method of making this leap, drawing conclusions about the current problem or issue based on what we know about another similar problem or issue. We focus on three forms of this kind of inductive argument: generalizations, analogies, and reasoning from general principles. In all three, a person makes an argument that we should accept conclusion X because the situation, problem, or issue is similar enough to another situation, problem, or issue that we already know something about. Generalizations. Generalizations are conclusions we draw about a whole category based on specific cases or examples we have from that category. We take something we know in a specific instance and apply it, generalizing it, to a larger group. We often think of generalizing as a bad practice, such as when we create stereotypes about certain groups of people. But the reality is we use generalizations all the time, often in necessary and positive ways. Generalizations help us to form reasonable expectations about how people, including ourselves, are likely to react in certain situations, or what will happen in a certain type of situation. We don't have to wait for the sun to come up tomorrow morning in order to expect that it will do so, and we plan our day accordingly. If you've showed up late for work 5 times in the last month, and every time your boss has docked your paycheck, then you can generalize that if you show up late this morning, your paycheck will be smaller, and perhaps you have a little extra incentive to try to get out of bed on time. Keep in mind, however, that generalizations typically tell us what is likely to happen in general. There's still room for exceptions. Maybe one morning you're late to work because you got in a car accident. And when you show up, your boss can see the damage to your car and decides, in this case, you have a good reason for being late. Some exceptions should cause you to modify an argument. If you previously claimed that my boss always docks my pay if I'm late, maybe now you would say, my boss usually docks my pay when I'm late. The extent to which we can apply generalizations ranges from all of the time to most of the time, or often down to sometimes. In addition to generalizations that we use in everyday life, there are common ways that researchers, politicians, and thinkers form generalizations. Surveys and experiments are frequently used to develop a general perspective on topics. People survey a sample of people to generalize on what the population might believe, or study a certain number of some group, for example, members of a species of animal, to generalize about the whole group. Based on the results of the survey or observation, the researchers are able to make a general claim about all or most of the group to which the subjects belong. These can be very useful and are efficient forms of generalizations. On the other hand, it is important to be aware of the limitations of generalizations. Just because we observe something that seems to be a pattern does not mean that it will always hold. You should be careful not to commit the common error of overgeneralizing. Overgeneralization occurs when someone argues that an observed pattern or tendency applies to all cases when really it only applies to some. Or a person believes that an event never happens when it really occurs just rarely. Overgeneralizations go beyond what the evidence reasonably allows you to claim. Overgeneralization can also occur when a generalization is based off inappropriate sample information. When a person generalizes, he or she extends something they know about a sample population or group to the larger whole. If the sample is not appropriate, then the generalization is wrong. One problem can be that the sample you based your generalization on is too small. So, for example, if you want to draw a conclusion about what the entire population of the United States believes on a certain topic, it would not be sufficient to ask just 3 individuals what they would believe. 300 might not be enough. Another problem with generalizing from the sample is that it should be representative of the whole. If you want to make an argument about the beliefs of all Americans, you could not generalize from a survey of people from California or South Florida. Analogy. Another common method of reasoning from one example or sample case to another is by way of analogy. Analogies are good ways for us to think about what might happen in a new situation based on what we know about an old one. Arguing by analogy means that you say, because A is similar to B, then if we know that X is true for A, we have reason to believe that X is also true for B. For example, a basketball is round and it rolls. A soccer ball is also round, so it should also roll. An analogy is judged to be more or less strong based on how similar the two examples or situations are. When you're presented with an argument by analogy, you must closely examine the two situations being presented. Ask yourself, in what ways are they similar? Are there any ways in which they're not similar? And how important are these differences? All analogies are imperfect. The whole idea is that you're comparing two situations that are not identical, but fairly similar. Your task is to figure out if they are sufficiently similar. You can be sure judgment about whether they're similar enough by asking, are the similarities relevant to the conclusion being made, and whether the differences between them are significant enough to undermine the analogy. It's an error of reasoning when a person relies on a weak or false analogy. An analogy where the two cases are only similar in a few ways is a weak one. The conclusion of a weak analogy may not be, strictly speaking, wrong, but since it is weak, it is not strong support for the argument. A false analogy is one in which none of the important or relevant features are similar, although the two cases may be similar in other ways that aren't relevant to the issue. So it's a false analogy to argue that basketball and baseball are both played with balls, so if you're good at basketball, you should be good at baseball. General principles. A final method of building an argument based on the relationship between different situations is by applying a general principle. This kind of argument is the opposite of a generalization. Remember, generalizations take information about specific cases and apply them to the group as a whole. An argument from general principles takes something that is true or held to be true about the whole and applies it to a specific case that is determined to fall within that larger whole. For example, many people hold the belief that taxi drivers disregard traffic regulations. It would be a mistake to argue that this general belief about taxi drivers applies to all taxi drivers. The strength of an argument based on the application of a general principle depends on how acceptable the principle is. In addition, the strength of the argument is also based on the degree to which the specific case fits into the category covered by the principle. The specific case must be like that broader category in all key relevant ways. When a general principle is applied to a specific case that does not fit, then the author of the argument has made an error in misapplying the general principle. As you've heard, there are a variety of ways to formulate inductive arguments. In this episode, you learned about using generalizations, analogies, and general principles to make an argument about a new or unfamiliar issue based on something that is known about a related issue or topic.